Hey guys, this is Miss Salceda, and this is Chapter 5, The American Revolution. Now, after the 7 Years' War that we went over in Chapter 4, Britain is going to have one of the largest empires and the biggest debt that came along with it. It moved to redefine its relationship with the colonies. Now, the Prime Minister at the time, pictured here, George Grenville, he's going to order the Navy to strictly enforce the navigation laws that we went over earlier. In 1764, he is going to have Parliament pass the Sugar Act, which is going to be the very first law passed by Parliament to raise money, tax dollars for Britain. This is going to increase the duty on sugar from the West Indies. After bitter protests, the duties were lowered, but it wasn't really big of a deal because only the wealthy, only the elite were able to afford sugar. It was a luxury item. So the common people weren't actually affected by it. It was just the wealthy. And they're like, we need sugar. We might as well get it. Resentment, though, is going to be renewed when the Quartering Act is going to require colonies to provide food and quarters for the British troops that were still stationed there. Now, one thing that totally infuriated the colonists was the Stamp Act passed in 1765. Its main goal was the tax dollars were going to go to support a new military force. It mandated the use of a stamped paper or affixing the stamps to prove that you paid for it, like a receipt. They were required on bills of sale for about 50 different trade items, including playing cards, marriage licenses, death certificates, diplomas, literally anything that was made out of paper. And people in England are going to pay a higher tax. And they couldn't understand why the colonists were so mad because the colonists were maybe paying 2%. England was paying like 10%. Like, what's the big deal? You should be lucky it's only 2%. Americans, nonetheless, were still angry. This is going to really pinch their pocketbooks, and they're really going to feel that they shouldn't have to pay it. A lot of them refused to comply with the Quartering Act. They refused to provide housing for the soldiers, and some voted only to supply a fraction of the supplies that was requested. This is also going to jeopardize the basic rights of colonists. Courts are going to, or offenders were tried in admiralty courts without juries, and it was under innocent until proven guilty. So you know they were going to be found innocent. Now, with the French and Indians defeated, why was there a military in the Ohio River Valley? The colonists are going to think it was the British conspiracy to take away their liberties. And the Stamp Act is going to be the focus of their anger. Americans are going to start making a sweet distinction between legislation and taxation. Parliament had the right to legislate, but they did not say Parliament had the right to Americans, and they had no right to tax them. Only colonial assemblies could tax the colonists. Grenville is going to rebut and say, but we have the theory of virtual representation. No matter where you live, you're still an Englishman, you're still protected by Parliament, you still need to pay the parliamentary tax. This is only going to cause Americans to deny the authority of Parliament and consider their own independence down the road. Colonial protests against the Stamp Act is going to take different forms. The Stamp Act Congress is going to be created in 1765. It's going to list the grievances of the colonists. They're going to beseech the king and parliament to repeal it. It was ignored, as most petitions are, but it was a significant step towards intercolonial unity. Non-importation agreements were made against British goods. So we boycotted. And it affected them where it hurt them the most. And where is that? Money. Because what's the bottom line? Money. Now, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty are going to take the law in their own hands. They're going to cry liberty, property, and no stamps. And by the time the act went into effect, all stamp agents had been forced to resign thanks to their tarring and feathering. The boycott is going to hurt the English economy. Parliament is going to have no choice but to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. And they're going to instead pass the Declaratory Act saying, we repeal this act, but in the future we might pass more if we want to. We're not, but maybe we might, because we have that power. The stage was set for the confrontation because they wanted their own sovereignty. And here you can see a drawing of a tax collector being tarred and feathered and being forced to drink scalding tea. And you could see some people in the background dumping tea from the ships. There's a video that I'm going to link to later from John Adams' documentary miniseries on HBO, which shows a tarring and feathering, and it is grotesque. Now, the Townshend Act of 67 is going to impose a lighter tax on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea, and it was an indirect customs duty that was payable at American ports. Colonists refused to pay it because they weren't represented by them, and they were mostly upset because this was going to pay the salaries of the royal governors that the colonists themselves refused to pay for in Chapter 4. Non-importation agreements are going to be renewed against the Townshend Act. That means boycott. Colonists are going to take the new tax less seriously, and they found all they had to do was smuggle. To enforce the order, the British are going to land 2 regiments of troops in Boston to enforce it and to protect the tax collectors. But tragedy is going to strike on March 5th, 1770, in the clash known as the Boston Massacre. So what's going to happen is the British soldiers are going to be guarding the custom house, and the colonists are going to be hanging out around them all day. They're going to be harassing them, throwing oyster shells and snowballs and just calling them names the whole day. And by the end of the day, when everybody got off work and they started, upping up their game, they're going to start throwing objects at him. One of the soldiers is going to have the gun taken out of his hand, and he's going to be hit in the face with it. And we don't know why, we don't know how, but somebody yelled fire. And of course, there were accounts in the documentary. I'm going to show you that video from John Adams. There was actually a building on fire. So the church bells were ringing, alerting the townsfolk that there was a fire. A soldier probably heard fire and started firing his gun. Others did. And when all was said and done, 5 people were killed, including Crispus Attucks, the first African American. Both sides did share blame, but only 2 redcoats were found guilty. The soldiers were then released after being branded on the hand. Their defense lawyer was John Adams. By 1770, George III was attempting to assert the power of the monarchy. He doesn't look so young there. He surrounded himself with yes men and anybody who would just do what he said, especially his Prime Minister, Lord North. Now, the Townshend Acts failed to generate any kind of revenue, so it was an epic failure. It had one job: make money. They did produce near rebellions, and non-importation boycotts did hurt the economy. So the Townshend Act was an epic failure. So Parliament decides to repeal the Townshend Act, but they kept the tax on tea just because. British officials increased efforts to enforce the navigation laws, and Samuel Adams is going to continue to incite what he called his trained mob. He's also going to organize his first committees of correspondence in Massachusetts. Now, the committees of correspondence are going to be organized in Boston, and 80 other towns through the colonies are going to create their own as well. They're basically going to be an open line of communication, telling events between the colonies. It is intercolonial correspondence. Virginia is going to lead the way in 1773, and then 12 other colonies are going to join the effort. And I need to pause here to tell y'all, there were not only 13 British colonies. Canada had colonies, but they chose not to rebel. Only 13 of the 14 or 15 colonies rebelled. In 1773, the British East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and they had 17 million pounds of unsold tea thanks to the boycott. British ministry is going to give them a complete monopoly of the American tea business, and colonists are going to see this as an attempt to trick them into paying taxes. So British authorities are going to enforce the law. Colonists are going to rise up in anger, mass demonstrations, and only in Boston did a British official refuse to be cowed. I don't know what it says under that. Hutchinson infuriated Boston's radicals when he ordered tea ships not to leave the Boston harbor until they had unloaded the cargoes, even though nobody was going to buy it. On December 16, 1773, about 100 Sons of Liberty, disguised vaguely as Native Americans, are going to board the ship and dump 342 cases of tea into the Boston harbor. This is known as the Boston Tea Party. And there's a video for you. Sympathetic colonists are going to say, wow, good job, man, that's good. They refer to tea as a badge of slavery. They burned the hated leaves in solidarity with Boston. Hutchinson, chastened and disgusted, retreated to Britain, never to return. The British chose a perilous path, and it's only going to lead to anguish. Parliament is going to punish the colonists for their Boston Tea Party with the intolerable acts or the coercive acts. These are going to be really drastic. The one that was really most hurtful was the Boston Port Act. This is going to close the port of Boston until all of the tea was paid for. All 342, what are they called? Chests of tea. Other intolerable acts limited rights. The restrictions were placed on town meetings. Officials who killed colonists in the line of duty could be sent to Britain for trial. You can't do that. Yeah, you can. New Quartering Act gave local authorities power to lodge soldiers anywhere, even in private homes. From America's viewpoint, the act was noxious. It had a much wider range. It set a dangerous precedent by denying jury trials and allowing these assemblies. It alarmed land speculators and it angered anti-Catholics because all of the land that you can see there in the map was suddenly now being given to Canada, who were French Catholics, and the Protestants hate Catholics. So that was also one that was really bad. Now, American dissenters are going to respond by doing several things. Colonies are going to send food to Boston by land since the port was closed. Rice is going to be shipped from South Carolina so that the Bostonians didn't starve. But the most memorable effect of this is going to be the creation of the First Continental Congress in 1774. They're going to be meeting in Philadelphia. 12 of the 13 colonies, except Georgia, is going to be sending 55 men. Samuel Adams, John Adams, George Washington, Patrick Henry, and they're going to deliberate for 7 weeks. It wasn't really a legislative body. It was just them talking about ideas. It was a convention, and they are going to draw up a Declaration of Rights, as well as a solemn appeal to other British colonies, to the king, and to the British people. The association was created. It called for a complete and utter boycott of British goods, non-importation, non-exportation, non-consumption. Don't buy it, don't sell it, don't eat it. Delegates were not calling for independence. We never talked about independence yet. They just wanted to repeal the intolerable acts. Now, Parliament is going to reject these petitions. Like, we're not going to listen to you. Violators are going to be tarred and feathered. Muskets were gathered and the men began to practice and drill openly. By 1775, the British commander is going to try to arrest the 2 ringleaders of the Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, as well as pick up some gunpowder that they knew were in Concord. So they're on their way to Concord, and they're going to meet at Lexington. The Minutemen that were there refused to disperse. Shots are going to be fired, killing 8 Americans and wounding several more. Redcoats are then going to push on to Concord, where they suffered heavy losses, and Britain now had a war on its hands. So when the British went to Lexington, they weren't really prepared. The Minutemen weren't prepared, and the British were able to hurt them. But by the time they got to Concord, they totally got annihilated. So this is going to be the beginning of the American Revolution. The British had 7.5 million British, and the colonists only had 2.5 million. England had the wealth, they had the naval power, they had a professional army, and George III could hire foreign soldiers or mercenaries like the Hessians. The British enrolled 50,000 American loyalists and Indians, so the British did have significant strengths. But oppressed Ireland did require troops, so a lot of the good troops had to go to Ireland to put down the rebellion. France was just looking for payback for the French and Indian War. The London government was weak. There was no William Pitt, only stubborn George and his Prime Minister, Lord North. Most Britons didn't want to kill any Americans. And everybody didn't feel comfortable going to war. Now, Britain's army in America did operate under numerous difficulties. The generals were second-rate. Soldiers were brutally treated. They didn't have enough food. They had to operate 3,000 miles from home. And because of that, it was really hard to send troops, food, or supplies. Military orders were received months later. And America's geographical expanse was big. They had 1,000 miles by 600 miles that they had to maneuver. And there wasn't one capital. There were 13 states or 13 colonies with 13 cities. And the British armies, they weren't qualified to deal with the colonials. Americans are wisely traded space for time. So let's look at the American advantages. They had outstanding leaders in George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Eventually, they had foreign aid from France with General Lafayette. European officers volunteered to fight for pay, and Marquis de Lafayette did prove invaluable in securing further aid from France. Other conditions, they were fighting defensively. Colonials were self-sufficient in food and didn't have to rely on another country to feed them, and they had a moral advantage. They wanted it more. But they were poorly organized, and it was, what was I going to say? There was a lot of jealousy. Individual states wanted to be sovereign. They resisted attempts by Congress to exercise their power under the Articles of Confederation. And this is going to boil over the appointment of military leaders. I'm talking to you, Benedict Arnold. Economic difficulties did exist. Metal money had been drained away. The Continental Congress, unwilling to raise taxes, massively printed Continental money, which is going to drastically cause inflation. Inflation is going to skyrocket the prices of everything. In earlier wars, England provided funds and weapons. Rebels were caught. Sufficient stores of gunpowder, cannon, and other armaments could not be found in the agricultural colonies. And then at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, soldiers went without bread for 3 days in the cruel winter of 1778 and 1777, 1778. In one campaign, some men actually fainted because they hadn't eaten in days. Manufactured goods were in short supply, and clothing and shoes were very scarce. Militiamen were numerous, but they were unreliable, they weren't really trained well, and they were hit with a bad case of smallpox. In fact, a lot of the troops are going to be inoculated with a primitive vaccine of smallpox so that they were able to survive. Women are going to play a significant role. They maintained the farms while their men were away. Many female camp followers were cooks. They sewed in return for money and rations. One woman even dressed in men's clothing and served in the army. 7,000 to 8,000 regulars were finally whipped into shape by stern drill masters. German Baron von Steuben was the organizational genius. He was such a big deal in Germany, but there were rumors floating around that he may be gay, and he was banished. But their loss, our gain. Blacks fought and died for the American cause. Many states initially barred them from the military, but eventually about 5,000 blacks did enlist. The largest contingent came from northern states with numbers of the freed blacks. They fought at Trenton, they fought at Brandywine, Saratoga, to name a few. They also served on the British side, though. In 1775, the governor of Virginia said any slave who fought for the British would join the British Army and they would be freed. At the end of the war, the British evacuated 14,000 black slaves turned loyalists. Now, morale in the Revolutionary Army is going to be undermined by American profiteers. They're going to sell to the British because they could pay in gold. And what's the bottom line? Money. Speculators forced prices sky high, and some Bostonians made profits of 50 to 200%. Only a minority of colonists selflessly devoted themselves to the cause of independence, and seldom have so few done so much. Oh, skip that part. Okay, so the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1775. The choice was made with a considerable misgivings, and they selected George Washington as leader of the army. He never rose above the rank of colonel. His largest command had only been 1,200, and he lost more battles than he won. They just could not get over the fact that he was totally defeated at Fort Duquesne. But he was patient. He had courage. He had self-discipline. He served without pay. I mean, he was a wealthy plantation owner, but he kept a careful list of expenses, 100,000. The Continental Congress chose more wisely than it knew. So here's George Washington with his faithful horse, Nelson. Wars of inconsistency are going to be fought for 14 months. Gradually, tempo of warfare increased. In May 1775, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold are going to capture garrisons at Ticonderoga and Crown Point in New York. Those are loyalist holdings. And in June, the colonists are going to seize Bunker Hill. In 1775, Congress is going to adopt the Olive Branch Petition. So we weren't yet at war. We are going to sign a petition that is asking the king for forgiveness, saying just get rid of the taxes and, let's just call it evens and, we'll be good. They begged the king to stop the war, and the king totally ignored it. He proclaimed colonies in open rebellion. He said any kind of fighting or skirmish is now treason, punishable by hanging. He hired thousands of Hessians or German mercenaries. Oh, I see. Okay. I hadn't read that part about it. Most of the soldiers came from a German principality of Hesse, which is why they were called Hessians. The colonists were so surprised that the king actually hired and paid for troops. They were good soldiers, of course, but they were, of course, received from Germany because the king's grandfather they were from Germany. The British are going to burn Portland, Maine. In autumn, the rebels are going to undertake a two-pronged invasion of Canada. It was a successful assault, and it would add a 14th colony and deprive Britain a valuable base for striking them, but they are going to refuse to be involved in the revolution. It was offensive warfare. Now, it was almost successful. Richard Montgomery is going to capture Montreal. The assault on Quebec is going to, and he's going to be joined by General Benedict Arnold, pictured there. Montgomery is going to be killed. Benedict Arnold is going to be wounded, and bitter fighting is going to continue. The British are going to set fire to Norfolk, Virginia. The British are going to be forced to evacuate Boston. But in the South, the rebels are going to win two victories. They're going to win at Moores Creek and at Charleston Harbor. And here you could see the map. Now, loyalty to the empire is going to be deeply ingrained. They were, their whole life, they were British subjects. Colonial unity was weak. They were told open rebellion was dangerous. It was a hanging offense. So colonists are going to be shocked into recognizing the need to separate, and this is going to be done by Thomas Paine. He's going to write Common Sense in 1776, and he's going to begin with a treatise on natural government, that the just powers from the consent of the governed. If the government is failing you, you have the right to overthrow it. 120,000 copies of Common Sense were sold in the first week, and he basically convinced Americans to support independence. He tried to convince colonists that the true cause was independence. Nowhere in physical universe did smaller heavenly bodies control the larger ones. So why should a tiny island of Britain control America? So he drafted foundational documents: American independence, American foreign policy, and only with independence could we truly get foreign assistance. He also called for a republic, creation of a new kind of political society, and Republican government. Before Paine, he referenced classical Greece and Roman, the 17th century revivalist Renaissance, appeal to British politicians, etc. His summons to create a republic are going to fall on receptive ears. New Englanders practiced a kind of republicanism already in town meetings and elections. Now, most Americans did consider citizen virtue fundamental to any successful government, must sacrifice personal self-interest, collective goods of the people, and he inspired contemporaries to view America as a fertile ground for civic virtue. Not all patriots, though, agreed with Thomas Paine. Some of them said a natural aristocracy should be in charge. Contest over American republicanism is going to continue for 100 years. On June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia is going to move that these united colonies and of right ought to be free and independent. It was adopted on July 2nd. Motion was a formal declaration of independence by the colonies. An inspirational appeal was needed to enlist other British colonies, to invite assistance from nations, and to rally resistance at home. Congress is going to appoint a committee to prepare a formal statement. All of this fell to Thomas Jefferson. He was fully qualified for it. So the Declaration of Independence was formally approved by Congress on the 4th of July, 1776. It had universal appeal by invoking natural rights. He had argued that the king had flouted these rights and we were justified in cutting ties with them. And he set forth a long list of tyrannous misdeeds by George III. Loyalists, however, were 16% of the American people. Families were often split between the loyalist and the patriot cause. Many of them were educated and wealthy and wanted to continue being wealthy under the king. Most of them were the older generation. It included king's officers and beneficiaries and clergy. They were mostly in New York City and Charleston, Quaker, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, but not so much in New England. Before the Declaration, persecution of loyalists was mild. Some faced brutality, such as tarring and feathering. Harsher treatment is going to continue after the signing of the Declaration. Anybody who did not support the declaration were regarded as traitors. Some were roughly handled. A lot of them were killed. Yeah, 80,000 loyalists were driven out or they fled to Canada. Several 100,000 were allowed to stay. The estates of fugitives were confiscated and sold. Some 50,000 loyalists did fight for Britain. Britain did not make effective use of the loyalists. Now, Washington could only muster 18,000 ill-trained troops. Disaster befell Americans at the Battle of Long Island. Washington escaped to Manhattan Island, and he finally reached Delaware River. The Patriot cause was at low ebb. General William Howe did not crush the American forces, so he is going to sneakily cross the Delaware River on December 26th, midnight after Christmas. He's going to surprise all of those thousands of Hessians that were celebrating Christmas and were partying and were drunk. A week later, he defeated a force at Princeton, and this is basically going to solidify his reputation. There he is with Nelson. London officials adopted intricate scheme to capture the Hudson River. General John Burgoyne would push down Lake Champlain from Canada. General Howe would meet up the Hudson and meet Burgoyne near Albany, and a third force under Colonel Barry would come west from Lake Ontario. So it was a three-pronged attack. That is what was supposed to happen. British didn't reckon with General Arnold, so came along St. Lawrence to Lake Champlain. His fleet was destroyed, but time had been won. So without Arnold, the British would have recaptured Fort Ticonderoga. If Burgoyne could have started there, he could have been successful. But because he had to stop and fight the colonists, he wasn't able to go and rendezvous. Washington transferred his army to Philadelphia. He was defeated in two battles. General Howe settled down in Philadelphia. Washington retired to Valley Forge. Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga to Horatio Gates. Saratoga ranks among the decisive battles because France is going to be compelled to help the colonies. Now, the French's role, France hoped to regain former prestige because they had lost a lot of land during the French and Indian War. America's revolutionaries badly needed help. American rebels harbored revolutionary ideas, and they wanted to end colonialism and mercantilism. In the summer of 1776, Continental Congress drafted a model treaty. John Adams said no political connection. Let me pause real quick. All right, looks like my computer is going to restart. John Adams, one of chief authors, described basic principles. No political connection, no military connection, only a commercial connection. These were remarkable self-denying restrictions to France. Benjamin Franklin did negotiate the treaty. He was determined that his appearance should herald diplomatic revolution. He shocked the royal court. The British now offered a measure allowing Americans home rule. So remember when we wrote the Olive Branch petition and said, just drop the taxes, please. England is like, hey, remember that Olive Branch petition? Yeah, let's do that. And the colonists were like, shh, like that. This was essentially what colonists had asked for. On February of 1778, France offered a treaty of alliance. This is known as the Franco-American Alliance. Young Republic concluded its first entangling military alliance that would soon regret. Yeah, we're going to get to that in a bit. Treaty with France is going to offer official recognition of our independence. So, excuse me, I have hiccups. Two countries had to officially recognize American independence, and France was one, so they're halfway there. England and France are going to come to blows in 1778. Shots fired at Lexington widened into the global conflagration. Spain entered in 1779, as did Holland, because everybody hated England. Weak maritime neutrals of Europe are going to demand their rights. Russia's Catherine the Great is going to organize armed neutrality, lining up remaining European neutrals against Britain. Fighting in Europe and North America as well, Americans deserve credit for keeping war going until 1778 with secret French aid. Their independence was not achieved until conflict became a multi-power war, too much for Britain to handle. From 1778 to 1783, France provided rebels with guns, money, equipment, and armed forces. Forced British to change their basic strategy. They counted on blockading colonial coasts. The French now had a powerful fleet in American waters. The British decided to evacuate Philadelphia and concentrate in the Loyalist city, New York City, redcoats were attacked by Washington. The battle was indecisive and Washington remained in the New York area. This one's a long one. French army of 6,000 regular troops under Comte de Rochambeau arrived in Newport. French gold and goodwill is going to help. No real military advantage, but Benedict Arnold is going to turn traitor because he was not given a promotion and control of a certain group of troops like he should have gotten. A British planned to roll up colonies starting in the south. Georgia was overrun. Charleston fell, and these are all major loyalist standings. By 1781, America wiped out British at Kings Mountain and then at Cowpens. Nathanael Greene is going to distinguish himself with his strategy of delay. He is going to stand there and then retreat, exhaust his foe, and George Wallace is going to be trying to pursue him. And it's like he was like trying to just get him tired. He wasn't seriously trying to fight him. It was like stalling him. Greene succeeded in clearing most of Georgia and South Carolina of the British troops, as you can see from this map. Now, the West is going to be ablaze during the war. Indian allies of England are going to attack colonists. Two nations of Iroquois Confederacy, the Oneidas and the Tuscarora, are going to side with the Americans. The Senecas, the Mohawks, the Cayugas, and the Onondagas. Let me try that again. Onondagas are going to join on the British side. However, they're going to be encouraged by Chief Joseph Brant, who believed victorious Britain would restrain the white need to take more land. In 1784, the pro-British Iroquois are going to be forced to sign the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. This is going to be the first treaty between the United States and Native American nations. Indians are going to give most of their land. In Illinois, the British were vulnerable. They held only scattered posts, and George Rogers Clark is going to conceive the idea of seizing them by surprise, and there's a picture of him right there. He quickly captured Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. Clark's admirers have argued his success later forced British to cede region of the North Ohio River at a peace table in Paris. So here you can see Cahokia, Kaskaskia, and Vincennes. Americans' infant navy under Jean-Paul Jones' tiny force never made a dent in the massive fleet that the British had. The chief contribution was destroying the merchant ships because what's the bottom line? Money. And it carried war into the waters around the British Isles. Privateers are privately owned armed ships, basically legalized pirates. They were authorized by Congress to attack the enemy ships. Thousands of American privateers are going to respond with patriotism in mind, but it's about profit. 70,000 men on these ships. They captured 600 British ships, while British captured the same number of Americans. It was not an unalloyed asset. It diverted manpower from the main war, and it involved Americans in speculation. But it brought in needed gold. It harassed the enemy. Everybody loves that. And it raised American morale. So now we're in the home stretch. One of the darkest periods of war was from 80 to 81. The government was virtually bankrupt. It declared that it would repay debt at 2.5 cents per dollar. 2.5 cents per dollar. 2 pennies. Everybody was despairing. The sense of unity was withering. Mutinous sentiment. Cornwallis, though, is going to shoot himself in the foot. He is going to blunder into a trap. After a futile operation in Virginia, he's going to fall back to Yorktown. He was waiting for seaborne supplies and reinforcements, and he assumed the British still controlled the seas. What he didn't know was that the French controlled the seas. So the British Navy was superior to everybody. They slipped away. So Admiral de Grasse informed Americans that he could join them against Cornwallis at Yorktown. Washington made a swift march of 300 miles from New York to Chesapeake. He was accompanied by Rochambeau's French army. Washington besets the British at land, while de Grasse blockaded at sea. So Cornwallis is cornered. He surrendered with 7,000 of his men on October 19, 1781. Now, George III planned to continue. Fighting continued for a year after Yorktown with a lot of warfare. Washington's most valuable contributions were to keep the cause alive, army in the field, and the states together. The aftermath at the Peace of Paris. Many Britons were wary of war. They'd suffered losses in India and the West. The island of Minorca in the Mediterranean fell. Lord North's ministry collapsed. temporarily ending George III's rule, and the Whig ministry, favorable to Americans, replaced the Tory regime. So the Whig ministry, who supported the revolution, is going to take power in Parliament. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay are going to gather in Paris, and they instructed to make no separate peace and to consult with French allies at all stages. American representatives were chafed under directive. They knew it had been written by Congress under pressure from the French Foreign Office. So here they are, King George III, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, who was the other one? John Adams. I always forget John Adams. I'm assuming the one standing up. France was in a difficult position because they had included Spain or induced Spain to enter the war. Spain coveted immense trans-Allegheny area, so France desired the independent United States, but they wanted to keep the new republic east of the Allegheny Mountains. So what are they going to do? A weak America would be easier to manage, so France was paying a heavy price to win independence, and they wanted their money's worth. John Jay was unwilling to play the French game. He secretly made overtures to London, and London came to terms with the Americans' demands. The formal Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Britain recognized the United States. That is the second country required. It granted boundaries to the Mississippi, to the Great Lakes, and to Spanish Florida, and the Yankees retained access to the fisheries of Newfoundland. American concessions: the Loyalists would not be prosecuted anymore, and Congress was to recommend that the Loyalist property be given back that they had confiscated. Debts owed to British creditors be paid. British concessions: they accepted defeat because they lost. Now, the British terms were super liberal. They granted enormous Trans-Appalachian area. Inspired Americans made a separate peace. The French relieved with end of this costly conflict that they shouldn't have joined in the first place. And America alone is going to gain from world girdling war. It began national career with a splendid territorial birthright and a priceless heritage. And that is chapter 5. Thanks for watching.